the Medici. Just the name conjures images of power, beauty, and absolute ruthlessness. For centuries, this family reigned supreme in Florence, shaping art, politics, and even the very fabric of Europe. But beneath the gilded ceilings and magnificent frescoes, a dark undercurrent flowed. The pursuit of power often demands a steep price, and for the Medici, that price was paid in trust, loyalty, and sometimes blood. Prepare yourself for a journey into the heart of betrayal, where those closest to the Medici, and even the Medici themselves, dealt the most shocking blows. Number 7. Catherine de Medici and the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre. The year is 1572. France is a cauldron of religious hatred, bubbling with the conflict between Catholics and the Protestant Huguenots. At the heart of this volatile nation sits Catherine de Medici, daughter of Lorenzo, Duke of Urbino, a formidable woman and the Queen Mother of France. She had been regent for her sons, and even now her influence was undeniable. For years, Catherine had tried to steer a course of peace, fostering a marriage between her Catholic daughter Marguerite de Valois and the Huguenot leader Henry of Navarre. This union was meant to bring an end to the bitter religious wars that had torn France apart. Huguenot nobles flocked to Paris for the wedding, a grand spectacle that hinted at a new era of reconciliation. Admiral Gaspard de Coligny, a respected Huguenot military leader and a key figure in the peace efforts, held a position of growing influence with Catherine's son, King Charles IX. This burgeoning influence of Coligny, however, stirred deep anxieties within the Catholic faction at court, particularly among the powerful Guise family, who viewed the Huguenots as an existential threat to Catholic supremacy in France. Catherine herself, though a proponent of religious tolerance in principle, was a pragmatist and a staunch defender of her family's power. She grew increasingly wary of Coligny's sway over the young king, fearing he might push France into war with Catholic Spain, a move she strongly opposed. The political landscape was a treacherous maze of alliances and rivalries, where every word and gesture was scrutinized for hidden meaning. The wedding, meant as a symbol of unity, instead became a gathering point for all these simmering resentments. On August 22nd, just days after the wedding, an assassination attempt was made on Admiral Coligny. A shot from a window struck him, injuring his hand and arm, but not killing him. The attack immediately ignited outrage among the Huguenots in Paris, who suspected the Guise family and demanded justice. The king, Charles IX, initially promised a full investigation and visited Coligny, expressing his dismay. However, the failed assassination attempt set in motion a chain of events that would spiral horrifically out of control. Rumors spread like wildfire through the tense city. The Catholic populace, already inflamed by years of religious strife, feared a Huguenot uprising in retaliation for the attack on their leader. The Guise family, eager to eliminate their Protestant rivals, fanned the flames of suspicion and hatred. What transpired next remains a subject of intense historical debate, but the outcome was undeniably catastrophic. Historical accounts suggest that Catherine de Medici, along with a select group of Catholic royal counselors, convinced the young and impressionable King Charles IX that the Huguenots were planning an imminent rebellion to avenge Coligny and overthrow the monarchy. This narrative, presented with urgency and alarm, painted the Huguenot presence in Paris as a direct threat to the crown and the Catholic order. It was argued that decisive preemptive action was necessary to save the kingdom. The king, already volatile and susceptible to influence, was persuaded that he faced a choice between allowing a Huguenot revolt or striking first to protect his throne and the Catholic faith. On the night of August 23rd, the eve of St. Bartholomew's Day, a decision was made to eliminate the Huguenot leaders gathered in Paris. The precise extent of Catherine's direct involvement in orchestrating the full-scale massacre that followed is debated by historians, but her role in influencing the king's decision to authorize the initial killings is widely accepted. The bells of Saint-Germain-l'Auxerrois, a church across from the Louvre, began to toll in the early hours of August 24th, signaling the start of the horrific event. Catholic mobs, armed with daggers and pikes, surged through the streets of Paris. Admiral Coligny was among the first victims, dragged from his bed, killed, and his body thrown from a window. The massacre quickly spread beyond the targeted Huguenot leaders, engulfing ordinary Huguenots in a brutal wave of violence. The streets of Paris became a scene of unimaginable horror. Men, women, and children were hunted down and slaughtered indiscriminately. Homes were ransacked, bodies thrown into the Seine River. The violence was indiscriminate and brutal, fueled by years of pent-up religious hatred and fear. King Charles IX himself, caught in the frenzy, reportedly fired a musket from the Louvre Palace at fleeing Huguenots. The initial order to eliminate a few key leaders mutated into a city-wide purge. The betrayal here was multifaceted. It was a betrayal of the promise of peace symbolized by the royal wedding, a betrayal of the safe passage offered to the Huguenot nobles, and a betrayal of the king's own word to investigate the attack on Coligny. For Catherine de Medici, it was a political calculation that went terribly wrong, a desperate attempt to consolidate power and ensure Catholic dominance that resulted in an unprecedented bloodbath. The massacre continued for several days in Paris and then spread to other cities across France. And estimates of the dead range from thousands to tens of thousands. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre stands as one of the darkest chapters in French history, a stark symbol of religious intolerance and political expediency leading to horrific human cost. For Catherine de Medici, a Medici woman who had ascended to one of the most powerful positions in Europe, it stained her legacy forever. Her actions, born from a desperate desire to protect her family's power and the Catholic faith in a fractured kingdom, led to a monumental betrayal of trust and an explosion of violence that shocked Europe and deepened the religious divisions that would plague France for decades to come. The initial attempt to neutralize a perceived threat escalated into a widespread slaughter, proving that even a powerful Medici could lose control of the forces they unleashed. Number 6. Cosimo de Medici the Elder and the Albizzi family's machinations. The year is 1433, and Florence, the jewel of Tuscany, is a thriving republic, but its political waters are turbulent. For decades, the powerful Albizzi family, particularly Rinaldo degli Albizzi, had been the dominant force, their influence overshadowing many other prominent families. Yet, a new power was steadily rising, not through military might or explicit political office, but through immense wealth, astute banking, and a shrewd understanding of human nature. This rising star was Cosimo de Medici, known later as Cosimo the Elder. Cosimo was the head of the Medici Bank, which had branches across Europe, making him arguably the wealthiest man in Florence, and perhaps even in Europe. His family had cultivated a vast network of clients, debtors, and allies, spanning from artisans to popes. Cosimo's generosity, patronage of the arts, and his ability to subtly exert influence without holding official titles endeared him to the Florentine populace. He loaned money freely, supported public works, and often acted as a mediator in disputes, earning him widespread popularity and a quiet yet undeniable authority. This growing power and popularity, however, were viewed with increasing alarm and resentment by the established aristocratic families, especially the Albizzi. Rinaldo degli Albizzi, a staunch Republican and an old-school oligarch, saw Cosimo's influence as a direct threat to the traditional Florentine governance and to his family's long-held dominance. He believed that Cosimo's wealth and his network of clients were subverting the Republic from within, effectively buying loyalty and creating a de facto monarchy by stealth. The Albizzi family had controlled the Signoria, the governing council of Florence, for generations, and they were accustomed to being the ultimate authority. Cosimo's quiet ascendancy represented a new kind of power, one they struggled to comprehend or control. The tension between the two families grew, steadily becoming a palpable undercurrent in Florentine politics. Rinaldo degli Albizzi, frustrated by his inability to curb Cosimo's influence through conventional means, began to plot. He aimed to dismantle the Medici's power base and remove Cosimo from the Florentine scene entirely. He rallied his allies within the Signoria and sought to manipulate the city's legal and political institutions to achieve his objective. The opportunity arose when the elections for the Signoria resulted in a council dominated by Albizzi supporters. This gave Rinaldo the leverage he needed to make his move. On September 7th, 1433, Cosimo de Medici was summoned to the Palazzo della Signoria, ostensibly to discuss city affairs. It was a trap. Upon his arrival, he was immediately arrested and imprisoned in the Palazzo Vecchio, specifically in the infamous Alberhetto Tower, a small dark cell high above the courtyard. The charges brought against him were nebulous but grave treason, attempting to establish a tyranny and plotting against the state. These accusations were largely fabricated, designed to justify his removal and eliminate him as a political threat. The Albizzi faction, now in control of the Signoria, intended to hold a summary trial, aiming for an immediate conviction and execution. Cosimo, a man of profound foresight and connections, understood the gravity of his situation. His life was in immediate peril. While imprisoned, he refused the food brought to him for 4 days, fearing poison. His jailer, Federigo Malavolti, recognizing the immense power Cosimo still wielded, provided him with plain bread and allowed him to send messages. Cosimo's allies, though momentarily stunned by his arrest, quickly mobilized. They bribed key officials and worked behind the scenes to sway opinion. The Signoria was divided, with some members genuinely believing the charges and others wary of the Albizzi's blatant power grab and the potential for civil unrest. The betrayal orchestrated by the Albizzi was a profound violation of the political trust and the unwritten rules of Florentine civic life. They had used the instruments of the Republic to target a fellow citizen not for genuine crimes but for political rivalry. They had attempted to silence dissent and eliminate a powerful opponent through judicial murder. However, the Albizzi's plan faced unexpected resistance. Cosimo's widespread popularity and his network of allies proved more resilient than Rinaldo had anticipated. Niccolo Barbadori, a member of the Signoria, who had initially sided with the Albizzi, was persuaded to advocate for Cosimo. Giovanni Pucci, a pro-Medici gonfaloniere, also worked to mitigate the charges. Eventually, through persistent efforts and substantial bribes paid by Cosimo's supporters, the death penalty was avoided. Instead of execution, a sentence of exile was decreed. Cosimo de Medici was banished from Florence for 10 years, along with his brother Lorenzo and several of his key supporters. He was sent to Padua, then to Venice, effectively removing him from Florentine politics. The Albizzi family believed they had triumphed, ridding themselves of their most formidable rival. They celebrated their victory, confident that Medici power had been irrevocably broken. However, their triumph was short-lived. The betrayal of Cosimo by the Albizzi, though successful in removing him physically, ignited a deep resentment among the Florentine populace and Cosimo's vast network of clients and friends. The Florentine economy began to suffer almost immediately after Cosimo's departure, as his extensive banking operations and his patronage dried up. His debtors, no longer under his direct influence, struggled. The following year, in 1434, the tide turned dramatically. New elections brought to power a Signoria far more sympathetic to Cosimo. The Florentine people, disillusioned with the Albizzi's oppressive rule and missing Cosimo's influence and generosity, demanded his return. On October 5th, 1434, barely a year after his exile, Cosimo de Medici was triumphantly recalled to Florence. His return was a massive public spectacle, greeted with overwhelming enthusiasm. The Albizzi and their allies, now on the losing side, were themselves exiled from the city. Rinaldo degli Albizzi never returned to Florence. Cosimo's exile and triumphant return marked a pivotal moment in Florentine history. The Albizzi's betrayal, intended to destroy the Medici, instead cemented their power. Cosimo, returning stronger and more popular than ever, effectively became the uncrowned ruler of Florence. He learned from his brief absence that overt power grabs were dangerous. Instead, he perfected the art of ruling from behind the scenes, pulling the strings of government through loyal allies, maintaining the facade of a republic while exercising absolute control. The Albizzi's treachery, aimed at safeguarding their own authority, inadvertently paved the way for the Medici's undisputed dynasty, transforming Florence forever. Their betrayal was a miscalculation of epic proportions, ultimately leading to their own downfall and the rise of the very family they sought to destroy. Number 5. Pope Clement the Seventh's failed diplomacy and the sack of Rome. The year is 1527. The Holy Roman Empire, under the ambitious Charles V, and the Kingdom of France, under the equally ambitious Francis I, are locked in a titanic struggle for dominance in Europe. Caught in the perilous middle is the Papal States, led by Pope Clement VII, born Giulio de Medici, a cousin of Lorenzo the Magnificent. Clement VII was a man of culture and refined tastes, deeply concerned with the prestige of the papacy and the Medici family. However, his political acumen was often overshadowed by indecision, wavering loyalties, and a fatal underestimation of the ruthlessness of the great European powers. Clement inherited a complicated political landscape. His predecessor, Pope Leo X, also a Medici, had navigated complex alliances, often shifting his allegiance to benefit the Papal States and the Medici family. Clement attempted to follow this strategy, believing he could play Charles V and Francis I against each other, thereby maintaining the independence of the papacy and safeguarding his own political and dynastic interests. However, the stakes were higher and the players more dangerous. His initial actions showed a leaning towards France. In 1526, Clement VII joined the League of Cognac, an alliance formed with Francis I of France, Venice, Florence, and Milan. The explicit goal of this league was to curb the growing power of Charles V, whose vast empire now encompassed Spain, the Netherlands, Germany, and parts of Italy. This alliance was a direct challenge to the emperor, and it deeply angered Charles V, who viewed the Pope's actions as a profound betrayal. Charles V was a devout Catholic, but he also harbored a deep-seated resentment against Clement VII for what he perceived as political obstruction and a lack of support for his imperial ambitions. He felt Clement was betraying the spiritual duty of the papacy by engaging in such earthly political machinations against a fellow Catholic ruler. Clement's diplomacy was marked by constant shifts and attempts to appease both sides, a strategy that ultimately pleased no one and alienated everyone. He was caught between a rock and a hard place, trying to protect the Papal States and the fragile balance of power in Italy. However, his vacillation was perceived as weakness and treachery by the formidable European monarchs. When Charles V's forces, a massive army largely composed of battle-hardened Landsknechts and Spanish veterans, began to march south into Italy, Clement VII found himself in a desperate situation. He had underestimated the emperor's resolve and the speed of his forces. The League of Cognac proved ineffective in halting the imperial advance. Clement, fearing the worst, tried to negotiate a separate peace with Charles V, abandoning his French allies. He even dismissed his papal guards in a misguided attempt to show goodwill, leaving Rome vulnerable. The imperial army, however, was a force unto itself. Composed of various nationalities and crucially unpaid for months, they were a ticking time bomb. Many of the German Landsknechts were Lutheran Protestants, harboring a deep hatred for the Catholic Church and the Pope. Their commander, Charles de Bourbon, a renegade French prince, was killed during the assault on Rome's walls on May 6, 1527. His death removed the last semblance of control over the enraged and leaderless troops. What followed was one of the most devastating acts of violence in European history: the sack of Rome. The soldiers, driven by greed, religious fanaticism, and sheer brutality, poured into the city. They looted, burned, raped, and murdered indiscriminately. Churches, palaces, and homes were desecrated. Priests and nuns were tortured, and sacred relics were destroyed. The devastation was absolute. Pope Clement VII, along with a few cardinals and members of the Swiss Guard, narrowly escaped from the Vatican through the Passetto di Borgo, a fortified elevated passageway to the Castel Sant'Angelo, the ancient Roman fortress. There, he was besieged for months, enduring humiliation and privation. The betrayal inherent in the sack of Rome is multifaceted. On one level, it was a profound betrayal of the papacy and the Holy City by the very forces of Catholic Europe. Charles V, though not directly ordering the sack, had unleashed an army that he could not control, an army that then turned its wrath upon the spiritual heart of Western Christendom. This was a betrayal of the emperor's duty as a Catholic ruler and a protector of the church. On another level, and more critically for the Medici, it was a betrayal enabled by Clement VII's own political ineptitude and a series of fatal miscalculations. His repeated shifts in allegiance, his underestimation of the emperor's fury, and his failure to adequately prepare Rome's defenses directly led to the city's tragic downfall. He betrayed the trust placed in him as Pope to protect the city and its people. His diplomatic maneuvering, meant to secure Medici influence and papal power, instead brought about the greatest humiliation the papacy had suffered in centuries and a catastrophic assault on the city he was sworn to protect. The sack of Rome was a devastating blow to the Renaissance and a brutal reminder of the precarious position of even the most powerful figures in a continent consumed by war and ambition. Clement VII, a Medici pope, had, through his own actions and misjudgments, inadvertently facilitated the profound betrayal of his city and his people. He had sought to play a grand Game of Thrones, but his inability to commit or accurately assess the strength of his adversaries led to the utter ruin of Rome. He eventually surrendered, humiliated, and spent months as Charles V's prisoner, paying a massive ransom and surrendering key territories. The sack of Rome marked the end of the High Renaissance in Italy and forever changed the political landscape, solidifying Charles V's dominance. For a Medici whose family prided itself on their wisdom and political cunning, Clement's actions represented a colossal failure, a betrayal of the very principles of statesmanship that had elevated his family to such heights. Number 4. The alleged poisoning of Francesco I and Bianca Capello by Ferdinando I. The year is 1587. Florence is under the rule of Grand Duke Francesco I de' Medici, the second Grand Duke of Tuscany. Francesco was a complex character, a patron of the sciences and arts, but also somewhat detached from the affairs of state, preferring his chemical experiments and his mistress, Bianca Capello. Bianca was a Venetian noblewoman who had eloped to Florence with a young banker and later became Francesco's official mistress, while his first wife, Joanna of Austria, was still alive. Their relationship was scandalous, defying societal norms and causing considerable friction within the Medici court and beyond. After Joanna's death in 1578, Francesco quickly married Bianca, elevating her to the title of Grand Duchess. This marriage was deeply unpopular with the Florentine nobility, and particularly with Francesco's younger brother, Ferdinando, a cardinal in Rome. Ferdinando de' Medici was a sharp, ambitious, and politically astute man, in stark contrast to his often melancholy brother. As a cardinal, he had amassed considerable wealth and influence in Rome, living a lavish life and maintaining a vast network of spies and informants. He openly disapproved of Bianca Capello, viewing her as an upstart outsider who had usurped the rightful place of a Habsburg princess, and he saw her as a corrupting influence on his brother and the Medici line. He believed Bianca was scheming to ensure her own descendants, even if illegitimate, inherited the Grand Duchy, or at least to secure a position of immense power for herself. Ferdinando, also worried about Francesco's perceived weakness as a ruler and his lack of a legitimate male heir. Francesco and Joanna had only daughters, and while he did have a son with Bianca, he died in infancy. This dynastic anxiety fueled Ferdinando's ambitions. The relationship between the two brothers was tense, characterized by a deep-seated rivalry and suspicion. Ferdinando resented Francesco's aloofness and his favoritism towards Bianca, while Francesco likely felt his brother's constant scrutiny and interference in Florentine affairs. Despite the animosity, a facade of family unity was often maintained for public appearances. In October 1587, Francesco and Bianca were staying at the Medici villa of Poggio e Caiano, a beautiful country retreat. They were joined by Ferdinando for a hunting party. The atmosphere, despite the strained relations, appeared outwardly cordial. On October 9th, both Francesco and Bianca fell gravely ill. Their symptoms were severe high fevers, vomiting, and excruciating stomach pain. Within days, both succumbed to their illness. Francesco died on October 19th, and Bianca followed him the very next day, October 20th. The sudden, simultaneous deaths of the Grand Duke and Grand Duchess immediately raised suspicions. The official cause of death was initially declared as tertian fever, a form of malaria common in the region. However, whispers of poison quickly spread throughout Florence and beyond. Though malaria was indeed prevalent, but the speed and synchronized nature of their deaths, coupled with the known animosity between Ferdinando and Bianca, made many believe foul play was involved. Ferdinando, being the next in line of succession, immediately assumed the role of Grand Duke, abandoning his cardinal's robes and his ecclesiastical career. His swift action in taking control fueled further speculation. The alleged betrayal here is one of the most dramatic and shocking in the Medici family history, a brother allegedly poisoning his own brother and sister-in-law to seize power. Historians have debated this event for centuries. Contemporary accounts, particularly those hostile to Ferdinando or sympathetic to Bianca, often hinted at or directly accused him of poisoning. Some historians suggest that Ferdinando orchestrated the poisoning to secure the Grand Duchy for himself and to eliminate Bianca, whom he despised. Others argue that it was indeed malaria, and that the timing was merely coincidental, or that the symptoms could have been exacerbated by other factors. In recent times, scientific investigations have attempted to shed light on the mystery. In the early 2000s, forensic toxicology tests were conducted on the remains believed to be those of Francesco and Bianca exhumed from their tombs. Some initial reports claim to have found traces of arsenic in Bianca's hair, suggesting poisoning. However, other analyses of different samples and further scientific debate have cast doubt on these findings, arguing that the levels of arsenic found might not be conclusive evidence of lethal poisoning, or that the contamination could have occurred post-mortem. The debate continues with no definitive scientific consensus. Regardless of the precise medical cause, the widespread belief at the time, fueled by the rapid succession of events and Ferdinando's immediate rise to power, was that a betrayal had occurred. The narrative of Ferdinando, the cardinal turned Grand Duke, coldly eliminating his brother, and the despised Bianca became entrenched in popular imagination. This dramatic family tragedy, whether a calculated act of fratricide or a tragic coincidence, remains one of the most compelling and unsettling episodes in the Medici saga. It highlights the brutal lengths to which family members would go to secure or maintain power, even within the seemingly unbreakable bonds of kinship. The simultaneous deaths and the swift succession solidified Ferdinando's rule, but they also cast a long, dark shadow of suspicion over his reign, a stain of alleged betrayal that lingered for centuries and continues to intrigue historians and the public alike. The Grand Duchy of Tuscany passed from Francesco to Ferdinando, marking a significant transition in Medici rule, shrouded in the ultimate family secret. Number 3. The expulsion of Piero de' Medici from Florence. The year is 1494. Florence, the cradle of the Renaissance, is once again in a state of political turmoil. The golden age of Lorenzo the Magnificent, a time of unparalleled artistic and intellectual flourishing, had ended with his death in 1492. His eldest son, Piero de' Medici, known as Piero the Unfortunate, inherited the vast Medici political machine and financial empire, but not his father's diplomatic genius or his popular touch. Piero was young, arrogant, and lacked the subtle political skills and the common touch that had allowed his predecessors, particularly Cosimo the Elder and Lorenzo, to maintain their grip on Florence while ostensibly upholding Republican traditions. He preferred extravagant displays of wealth and power, alienating the Florentine populace and the powerful families who had once been loyal to the Medici. Meanwhile, a new and formidable force was emerging in Italy, King Charles VIII of France. Driven by a desire to claim the Kingdom of Naples, Charles VIII began his invasion of Italy in September 1494, marching a massive army through the peninsula. His invasion sent shockwaves across Italy, destabilizing the fragile balance of power that Lorenzo the Magnificent had meticulously maintained. As Charles VIII's army approached Tuscany, Florence faced a critical decision: resist the French king or negotiate terms. Piero, displaying his characteristic misjudgment, initially attempted to resist the French. He fortified the Florentine territories and prepared for a confrontation. However, as the overwhelming strength of the French army became apparent, Piero's resolve crumbled. He panicked. Without consulting the traditional Florentine councils, or even his closest advisors, and abandoning the city's defensive preparations, Piero rushed to meet King Charles VIII at Sarzana, a town on the Tuscan border. In a desperate and humiliating attempt to appease the French king, Piero made a series of astonishing concessions. He surrendered crucial Florentine fortresses including Sarzana, Pietrasanta, Pisa, and Livorno, and granted the French army free passage through Tuscan territory. He also agreed to pay a large sum of money to Charles VIII. This unilateral decision, made without the consent of the Florentine government or the people, was viewed as an unforgivable betrayal. It was seen as an act of cowardice and an egregious surrender of Florentine sovereignty and territory. The people of Florence, who had long endured the Medici's de facto rule, had a strong sense of civic pride and republican ideals. Piero's actions were an affront to everything they held dear. The news of his capitulation arrived in Florence before he did, igniting widespread outrage and fury. Fueling this public discontent was the fiery Dominican friar Girolamo Savonarola. Savonarola had been preaching fiery sermons in Florence for years, condemning the corruption of the church, the moral decay of society, and implicitly the luxurious lifestyle of the Medici. He called for moral reform, a return to simple piety, and a rejection of worldly excesses. Savonarola's sermons resonated deeply with many Florentines who were disillusioned with the Medici's rule and the perceived decline of republican virtues. He prophesied divine punishment for Florence if it did not repent and reform, and he declared Charles VIII a divinely appointed instrument of God's wrath. As Piero's political blunders mounted, Savonarola's influence grew, making him a powerful voice against the Medici. When Piero returned to Florence on November 9th, 1494, he was met not with welcome, but with a city seething with rebellion. The gates of the Palazzo della Signoria were slammed shut against him. Attempts to rally support on the streets were met with hostility and cries of Popolo Libertà, people in liberty. The Florentine populace, supported by powerful anti-Medici families who had long chafed under their dominance, rose up against him. Piero, along with his brother Cardinal Giovanni de Medici, who would later become Pope Leo X, realized the futility of resistance. Faced with an angry mob and a city in open revolt, and lacking the deep connections and popular support that his father and grandfather had cultivated, Piero fled Florence under the cover of darkness. The expulsion of Piero de' Medici was a dramatic and shocking betrayal of the Medici family by the very city they had controlled for decades. It was a betrayal of their loyalty, their trust, and their long-held political authority. For the Florentine people, it was a reassertion of their republican ideals, a rejection of perceived Medici tyranny, and a direct response to Piero's monumental misjudgment. The immediate aftermath was swift and profound. The Medici Bank's assets were seized, and their palaces were looted. A new Florentine republic was established, heavily influenced by Savonarola's austere vision. The Medici were cast out, their carefully constructed power structure dismantled almost overnight. Piero's flight marked a temporary end to Medici rule in Florence, a period of exile that would last for 18 years. It was a testament to the fact that even the most powerful families, if they lost the popular touch and made grave political errors, could be overthrown by the will of the people. The betrayal was not a single act by an individual, but a collective turning away of an entire city, the public repudiation of a family that had once been synonymous with Florence itself. Piero's miscalculations regarding the French invasion and his subsequent capitulation shattered the delicate balance of power, creating an opening for a city weary of his arrogance and ready to reclaim its republican soul. The event serves as a stark reminder that even seemingly absolute power rests on the fickle foundation of public consent and the ability to adapt to changing political tides. For the Medici, it was a painful lesson learned, one that would shape their strategies for regaining and maintaining power in the turbulent century that followed. Number 2. Assassination of Alessandro de' Medici by Lorenzino de' Medici. The year is 1537. Florence is no longer a republic, but the Duchy of Florence, ruled by Alessandro de' Medici, the first Duke of Florence. Alessandro's rule was autocratic and often tyrannical, secured by the powerful backing of Emperor Charles V, whose illegitimate daughter, Margaret of Parma, Alessandro had married. His heavy-handed governance, his lavish lifestyle, and his disregard for Florentine republican traditions earned him many enemies, both within the city and among the exiled Florentine republicans who yearned for the return of a free city. Among Alessandro's closest companions was his distant cousin, Lorenzino de' Medici, often known by the damning moniker Lorenzaccio, meaning Bod Lorenzino. Lorenzino was a sophisticated intellectual, a poet, and a classical scholar, but also a complex and deeply troubled individual. He had spent time at the imperial court and was well versed in the political intrigues of the age. Despite their familial ties and close companionship, Lorenzino harbored a profound resentment towards Alessandro. While on the surface they appeared to be inseparable, sharing a life of debauchery and entertainment, Lorenzino secretly despised the Duke's tyranny and sought to emulate the classical heroes who had overthrown tyrants. He claimed his actions were driven by a desire to liberate Florence from Alessandro's oppressive rule and restore the Republic. Lorenzino meticulously planned his betrayal over a long period, cultivating Alessandro's trust and feigning unwavering loyalty. He acted as Alessandro's confidante, his companion in revelry, and even as panderer, frequently arranging assignations for the Duke. This deep level of trust was crucial to Lorenzino's scheme. Alessandro, oblivious to his cousin's true intentions, felt completely secure in Lorenzino's presence, seeing him as a harmless, if eccentric companion. The night of the betrayal came on January 6, 1537. Lorenzino lured Alessandro to his own house in Florence, promising him a secret rendezvous with a beautiful woman, who was, in fact, Lorenzino's own aunt, Caterina Soderini. Alessandro, always eager for such encounters, dismissed his guards and entered the house alone, accompanied only by Lorenzino. Inside, Alessandro was led to a bedroom, where he removed his cloak and sword, lying down to await the woman. This was the moment Lorenzino had meticulously prepared. As Alessandro lay vulnerable, Lorenzino signaled for his accomplice, a rough mercenary named Scoronconcolo. Together, they launched a brutal attack. Lorenzino himself, according to historical accounts, stabbed Alessandro repeatedly, perhaps as many as a dozen times. The Duke struggled fiercely, but his surprise and lack of weapons left him defenseless against the two attackers. He was ultimately suffocated, his body riddled with wounds. The assassination was swift and bloody, executed with a chilling precision that spoke to Lorenzino's premeditation and cold resolve. After the murder, Lorenzino and Scoronconcolo tried to flee Florence. Lorenzino left a note beside Alessandro's corpse, a public declaration of his act, claiming it was for the liberty of Florence. He then made his escape, initially finding refuge in Bologna, then Venice, and later France, desperately trying to rally support for a new republic. He sent letters to exiled Florentine Republicans, proclaiming himself a liberator and detailing his act. The news of Alessandro's assassination sent shockwaves through Florence and the courts of Europe. The betrayal was shocking, not only for its brutality, but for its intimate nature. A close kinsman and trusted companion turning against his own blood. The immediate aftermath in Florence was a scramble for power. The Florentine Republicans, though briefly hopeful, failed to capitalize on the chaos. Cosimo de Medici, another distant cousin of Alessandro, a young and ambitious man, quickly seized the opportunity. He was a relative unknown at the time, but shrewdly navigated the political currents, securing the support of the imperial ambassador and the Florentine Senate. Cosimo was promptly declared the new Duke of Florence, establishing a new, even more centralized branch of the Medici dynasty that would rule Tuscany for centuries. Lorenzino's betrayal, while personally devastating to Alessandro, did not lead to the restoration of the republic he claimed to champion. Instead, it merely ushered in a new, and in many ways more formidable Medici ruler in Cosimo I, who would ruthlessly consolidate power and crush any republican aspirations. Lorenzino himself spent the rest of his life as a hunted man, and Emperor Charles V offered a huge bounty for his capture, and agents of the Medici pursued him relentlessly across Europe. He was eventually assassinated in Venice in 1548, 11 years after Alessandro's death, by two agents sent by Cosimo I, bringing a violent end to his life. Lorenzino's betrayal of Alessandro remains one of the most personal and dramatic acts of treachery in the Medici family's history. It was a cousin against cousin act carried out under the guise of friendship and intimacy. The shock of it lay in the fact that Alessandro was killed by someone he trusted implicitly, in the very place he felt most secure. Lorenzino's motives have been debated. Was he a Republican idealist, a frustrated intellectual seeking glory, or a resentful relative seeking revenge? Regardless of his deeper psychological drivers, his actions constituted a profound betrayal of trust and kinship, a chilling testament to the lengths to which ambition, resentment, or political ideals could push individuals within the most powerful families of the Renaissance. The assassination, rather than freeing Florence, merely ensured the rise of a new and even stronger Medici line. Number 1. The Pazzi Conspiracy. The year is 1478. Florence is at the zenith of its Renaissance glory, largely due to the brilliant leadership of Lorenzo de' Medici, known as Lorenzo the Magnificent. Lorenzo, alongside his younger brother Giuliano, held an almost undisputed grip on the city, governing with a mixture of popular appeal, financial acumen, and subtle political manipulation. The Medici Bank was the most powerful in Europe, and the family's patronage had transformed Florence into a hub of art, philosophy, and innovation. However, their immense power also bred resentment among rival Florentine families, particularly the ancient and wealthy Pazzi family, who felt increasingly marginalized and overshadowed by the Medici's ascendancy. The Pazzi, though prominent, found themselves increasingly stifled by Medici control over finance and politics. They were often excluded from key public offices and lucrative business ventures. This simmering resentment was exacerbated by a series of specific disputes with the Medici, including a crucial financial affair involving the Papal States and a dispute over a substantial inheritance. The Pazzi felt humiliated and determined to reclaim their former standing. Their discontent found a powerful ally in Girolamo Riario, the aggressive and ambitious nephew of Pope Sixtus IV. The Pope himself, ambitious and seeking to consolidate papal power in Romagna, viewed the Medici as an obstacle to his plans, particularly Lorenzo's resistance to his expansionist policies. Sixtus IV had also grown increasingly wary of the Medici's influence over the Florentine church. Francesco Salviati, the Archbishop of Pisa, a Pazzi ally, was another key conspirator. He had been appointed archbishop by the Pope without Lorenzo's approval, further infuriating Lorenzo, who had then blocked Salviati's entry into Pisa. Salviati harbored a deep, personal grudge against the Medici. The conspirators, including members of the Pazzi family, Archbishop Salviati, Girolamo Riario, and a number of mercenaries and clerics, plotted a violent overthrow of Medici rule. Their plan was audacious and brutal, to assassinate both Lorenzo and Giuliano de' Medici simultaneously during a public event, ensuring that no Medici heir remained to challenge their takeover. They believed that once the Medici brothers were eliminated, the Florentine populace, oppressed by Medici tyranny, would rise up and support the Pazzi's liberation. They hoped to seize control of the Signoria, the Florentine government, and establish a new order. The plot was meticulously planned and involved a large number of participants. Initially, they considered assassinating the brothers at a banquet, but Giuliano did not attend. The conspirators then chose the High Mass at Florence Cathedral, Santa Maria del Fiore, on Sunday, April 26, 1478. The setting was ironic, a holy place, a solemn ceremony chosen as the site for a premeditated double murder. The moment chosen for the attack was the elevation of the host, when the congregation would be kneeling and their guard would be down. As the bell rang for the elevation, signaling the most sacred moment of the Mass, the assassins sprang into action. Bernardo Baroncelli and Francesco de Pazzi attacked Giuliano de Medici, stabbing him repeatedly. Giuliano, caught off guard, fell quickly, bleeding profusely from 19 wounds. Lorenzo de Medici, meanwhile, was attacked by two priests, Antonio Maffei and Stefano de Bagnone. However, Lorenzo, quick to react, managed to draw his sword and defend himself, aided by his friend Francesco Nori, who bravely shielded him. Although wounded in the neck, Lorenzo managed to fight his way to the sacristy, where he barricaded himself until help arrived. The entire congregation erupted in chaos and terror. The attack failed to eliminate both brothers, a critical miscalculation for the conspirators. The assassination of Giuliano, a handsome and popular figure, immediately turned the Florentine populace against the conspirators. Instead of rallying to the Pazzi, the people of Florence rose up in furious defense of Lorenzo and the Medici. The cry of "Pal, Pal," the Medici family's coat of arms, echoed through the streets. Lorenzo, despite his wound, emerged to address the crowd, solidifying their loyalty. The immediate aftermath was swift and brutal. The conspirators, caught in the act or identified by the enraged populace, were hunted down. Archbishop Salviati was seized and, still in his ecclesiastical robes, was lynched from the windows of the Palazzo della Signoria alongside Jacopo Pazzi. Francesco de Pazzi, severely wounded, was also dragged from his bed and lynched. Others involved were captured, tortured, and summarily executed. Jacopo Pazzi's body was initially buried, then dug up by an angry mob, dragged through the streets, and thrown into the Arno River. The retribution was swift and merciless. Even innocent members of the Pazzi family, or those remotely associated with them, suffered severe consequences, including imprisonment, torture, and death. The Pazzi conspiracy was the most direct and shocking betrayal of the Medici family. It was a betrayal of the trust placed in a prominent Florentine family, a betrayal of the sanctity of a religious ceremony, and a betrayal of the peace of the city. While it succeeded in killing Giuliano, it profoundly failed in its ultimate goal to overthrow the Medici. Instead, it solidified Lorenzo's power and popularity, portraying him as a survivor and a hero. The conspiracy also led to a brief but brutal war between Florence and the Papal States, as Pope Sixtus IV, furious at the treatment of his nephew and the Archbishop, excommunicated Lorenzo and placed Florence under interdict. The Pazzi conspiracy remains a dramatic example of political betrayal, a desperate and violent attempt to seize power that backfired spectacularly. It not only failed to dismantle the Medici dynasty, but strengthened Lorenzo's grip on Florence, further cementing his legend as Lorenzo the Magnificent. The ruthless execution of the conspirators served as a stark warning to any who dared challenge the Medici, proving that even a meticulously planned and religiously sanctioned betrayal could not break the power of Florence's most dominant family. The blood spilled on the cathedral floor solidified the Medici's rule, turning a moment of extreme danger into a triumph of their resilience and control.